Okay, so you want to buy an AK-47, the world's most popular rifle. Simple enough, right? Except here's the paradox nobody tells you about it. Researchers at the Small Arms Survey in Geneva estimate that somewhere between 70 and 100 million of these rifles have been produced since 1947, making it the most manufactured firearm in human history. And yet the man who invented it died on a modest Russian government pension, while the weapon itself made other people billions of dollars. So how does a rifle become the most ubiquitous machine on Earth without making its own creator rich? Why does the exact same gun sell for $50 in one country and tens of thousands in another? Why did the company that manufactures it get personally sanctioned by the United States Treasury? And why does the price of an AK-47 in a war zone sometimes signal exactly the opposite of what you'd assume? By the end of this video, you'll understand the real economics behind the most recognizable weapon on the planet, and why the story was never really about the rifle at all. Let's start with the price list, because this is one asset that comes in dramatically different tiers, depending entirely on where you are standing on the planet when you buy one. Tier 1 is the legal civilian semi-automatic version, sold in countries where that's permitted. In the United States, a semi-automatic AK pattern rifle from a manufacturer like Century Arms or Palmetto State Armory runs anywhere from $500 to $1,200, depending on build quality and whether the parts are imported or domestically made. These are legally registered, background-checked purchases, and mechanically, they function nothing like the fully automatic military version. One trigger pull, one round, just like any other semi-automatic rifle sold at a licensed gun store. Tier 2 is the original military-spec select-fire AK-47, capable of true automatic fire. In the United States, these are technically legal to own, but only if they were registered with the federal government before May 19, 1986, the date the Hughes Amendment froze the civilian machine gun registry completely. No new automatic weapons have entered civilian hands legally since. Because supply is permanently capped, while demand keeps climbing every year, current market data from firearms dealers puts a transferable factory select-fire AK-47 today at roughly $30,000 to $50,000, with fully authentic Soviet-manufactured examples sometimes reaching higher. Same rifle, same manufacturing cost as it had decades ago, but the price today is being set almost entirely by a single piece of 1986 legislation, not by the gun itself. Tier 3 is where things get uncomfortable, the black market. This isn't something we're going to walk you through accessing, but the economics of it are documented by organizations like the Small Arms Survey, and the range is genuinely staggering. In relatively stable but conflict-adjacent economies, a black market AK-47 has been tracked around $500 to a couple $1,000s. In active, collapsing conflict zones, that number crashes. In parts of Somalia during periods of severe instability, journalists and local sources have reported AK-47s trading for as little as $50 to $100, with one local report describing a moment when a goat briefly cost more than a rifle. Same weapon, sometimes a 40-fold difference in price, depending on the day and the region. And that gap alone tells you almost everything about how this particular economy actually works. Tier 4 is the collectors and historical market. And here, the AK-47 becomes an entirely different kind of asset altogether. An early production Soviet milled receiver AK-47 from the early 1950s, properly documented and demilitarized or legally transferable, can sell to collectors and auction houses for anywhere from the low tens of thousands into six figures for exceptional provenance-rich examples, the kind occasionally seen at firearms auction houses. Not because it fires any differently than a modern one rolling off a factory line today, but because it's a physical piece of Cold War history. So now you've picked your tier, here's where you'd actually go to buy one, and the path looks completely different depending on which tier you're in. Legal civilian versions move through licensed firearms dealers, background checks, and the entire regulated retail chain, no different from buying a hunting rifle. The vintage machine gun tier moves through a small, specialized network of Class 3 dealers who deal exclusively in that frozen 1986 registry, an extremely narrow market with a hard ceiling on supply that will never rise again. And the illegal tier moves through smuggling networks, crossing borders in parts of West Africa, the Sahel, and the Horn of Africa, a supply chain that has existed in some form since the Soviet Union first began exporting these rifles to Allied governments and insurgent movements back in the 1950s. Now here's the part that actually breaks people's brains. The reason the AK-47 is the cheapest, most available rifle on Earth has almost nothing to do with the gun itself, and everything to do with one decision the Soviet Union made in the 1950s that no other government has ever fully replicated since. The USSR didn't just manufacture AK-47s for its own army. It shared the manufacturing design with Allied communist governments as a tool of geopolitical influence. China built its own version as the Type 56. Egypt built the Mahdi. Bulgaria, Romania, Poland, and other Eastern Bloc states received either the technical documentation or Soviet-supplied tooling to manufacture their own AKs domestically, largely without the kind of licensing fees or royalty structures that would exist in a commercial arms deal, because the point of the arrangement was political alignment, not profit. By the time the Cold War ended, more than a dozen countries were producing AK pattern rifles completely independently of each other. That is close to the opposite of how every other dominant product in history stays dominant. A soft drink company guards its formula for over a century. A technology company sues competitors over patent infringement. The Soviet Union let its most effective infantry weapons spread across the world with barely a fraction of that same protection. And that decision is a major reason the gun costs less in some countries today than a second-hand bicycle. Which brings us to Mikhail Kalashnikov himself, the man whose name is permanently attached to the rifle. Born in 1919, he was a Soviet tank sergeant with no formal engineering degree, wounded in combat in 1941, who developed the rifle over several years of work and submitted it to a state weapons competition in 1947. It was adopted by the Soviet military in 1949 and eventually became the standard-issue rifle of dozens of nations across multiple continents. But because he worked inside a state design bureau, he received no royalties from the tens of millions of rifles produced under his name. He was given medals, a state salary, and the rank of general later in life, but never personally profited from the rifle's global spread. In a 2002 interview with The Telegraph, he said he wished he had invented something like a lawnmower instead, something that helped people rather than something whose reputation followed him for the rest of his life. In a letter to the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, written months before his death in December 2013, he wrote that he felt unbearable spiritual pain and asked whether he, as a believing Christian, bore some responsibility for the lives his invention had taken. The single most produced weapon on Earth made governments, insurgent movements, and arms dealers extraordinarily wealthy. It made its actual inventor almost nothing, and haunted him besides. Compare that to Victor Bout, a former Soviet military officer who became one of the most prolific arms traffickers of the post-Cold War era, moving weaponry across Africa, the Middle East, and South America throughout the 1990s and 2000s, using a private cargo aircraft fleet. In 2008, US Drug Enforcement Administration agents arrested him in a sting operation in Thailand, where he had been posing to meet supposed representatives of a Colombian guerrilla group. He was extradited to the United States in 2010 and convicted in 2011 on charges that included conspiring to kill Americans and providing material support to a terrorist organization, receiving a 25-year federal sentence. He served roughly 14 years before being released in December 2022 as part of a one-for-one prisoner exchange for WNBA star Brittany Griner. Bout never manufactured a single rifle. His fortune came entirely from moving already existing surplus stock out of collapsed Soviet bloc arsenals into active conflict zones, exploiting exactly the kind of global oversupply that the original Soviet distribution strategy had created decades earlier. And then there's the modern manufacturer, Kalashnikov concern, the Russian state-linked company producing the current generation of AK pattern rifles. On July 16, 2014, the US Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control formally sanctioned Kalashnikov concern following Russia's annexation of Crimea, blocking American persons and institutions from doing new business with the company and cutting off a market that had previously been one of its largest sources of hard currency revenue. According to the company's own later statements, it responded by opening new sales relationships in other regions to offset the loss. A company built around selling the most recognizable rifle on the planet suddenly found itself locked out of a major market, not because of any flaw in the product, but purely because of the geopolitics wrapped around it. And here's the twist that actually matters most. It's tempting to assume that a falling black market price always signals collapse, and a rising price always signals stability. But the real data cuts both ways. In Somalia, prices have crashed toward the $50 to $100 range during periods when stockpiles were suddenly looted and flooded the local market faster than anyone could absorb them. But in Afghanistan in 2012, researchers documented AK-47 prices roughly tripling in a single year, not because supply dried up, but because civilians, anticipating the NATO troop withdrawal and a possible security vacuum, began stockpiling weapons out of fear. In other words, the price doesn't move in one predictable direction as a country slides toward instability. Sometimes fear of collapse drives prices up as people arm themselves. Sometimes actual collapse drives prices down as looted stockpiles flood in. Either direction, a sudden, sharp move in the price of an AK-47 in a given region is one of the more reliable informal signals that something in that country's security situation is shifting fast. So let's put a number on what all this actually means. If you're a licensed dealer selling the legal semi-automatic tier in the United States, your margin per unit is fairly modest, similar to any regulated firearms retail business, and volume is what makes that business work. If you're operating in the vintage pre-1986 machine gun tier, you're essentially trading in a fixed, permanently shrinking asset class, one where scarcity alone has pushed prices into the tens of thousands, with no new supply ever entering that market again. And if you're looking at the black market tier, the number that actually matters isn't the price tag on the rifle. It's what that price movement is quietly telling you about the region it's sitting in. So if you're still set on this idea, remember the real lesson buried inside this entire industry. The AK-47 didn't become the most common rifle on the planet because it's the single best rifle ever engineered. It became the most common rifle on Earth because one government decided, 70 years ago, that spreading the design was worth more to its influence abroad than protecting it ever could have been worth in profit. Every price you see today, from a few $100s on a shelf in an American gun store to $50 changing hands in a collapsed market, is just the aftershock of that one decision, still rippling outward decades later.